Well, hello and welcome everybody to our webinar for the North American Bears Expert Team. This is part of our ongoing webinar series. We appreciate everybody being here and being on the call. We have lots of other BSG members from across the world on the webinar as well. Keep in mind, these will be recorded and this will join all the other webinars that are on our YouTube site. And you'll get a link to where those are if you haven't seen them already. Today's webinar will be placed on that. So there's an echo there. We also want to invite our committee members who haven't presented webinars yet to get a hold of Rich and I and be able to present a webinar. We've got an opening in July right now. So if anybody's interested in presenting who's on the North American Bear Expert Team, let us know. Like always, we will finish within 1 hour to respect everybody's time. And you can ask questions at any time in the function there at the bottom. And we'd like the webinar to leave time for questions and discussion at the end. That often is the best part. We ask you to mute your microphones other than the speakers so that we don't have any background noise. I would like to remind you, everybody, that the NABBA team has 3 presentations in the next 30 days. And we have a special panel discussion on habituation in bears on May 10th, which should prove to be very interesting. We're using a particular bear as an example, but there's also one in Italy that is another example. So today's webinar is the status and conservation of small brown bear populations in Canada. Bruce and McLellan, Michelle McLellan, Michael Proctor, and Clayton Lamb. So take it away, Bruce.
Thanks, Chris. I could have probably added a couple more people as authors too, like Garth and even Steve Rochetta, because there's quite a few of us have been working on these southern bear populations. So here we go. So today, what I think we want to cover is the first thing is introduce the IUCN Redlisting process and how it was done for brown bears. I realize that most of us are either bear managers or bear researchers, and we're most interested in conservation of bears, and we want to talk about bear management. But we also are part of the IUCN, and one of the major things the IUCN does, as most of you no doubt know, is they do their red list of threatened species. And because of that, and because the North American team is fairly new, there might be people that don't know much about it. So I thought I'd just go over that a little bit, because I am the red list focal point, and I like to, tell people about it. And we'll also let you know about the isolated populations in southern Canada, give a little bit of Canadian content to our group, and discuss some factors influencing their fragmentation. Well, I should say, wait a second, when we were talking about bear culture before, these little guys this picture was taken very close to my house, actually, on the dry side of the coastal mountains. And if you know much about grizzly bears, you could say, well, they just look like Yellowstone bears or Rocky Mountain bears or interior bears. They're silver-tipped, typical grizzlies. This picture was taken April 20th last year, and it was only about 50 miles away from here on the wet side of the mountains. And you can see, boy, what a different looking bear. And that I could tell by just looking at him is a big fat salmon eating bear. Different color, different culture, although they cross all the time. Anyway, they also molt differently. Interesting area, the southern coastal mountains. Okay, back to the red list. I digressed there. So every decade or so, we do a red list assessment of all thousands of species. Of the bears, we do the 7 that our group is involved with, not the polar bear. And the assessment is based on 5 criteria. And the criteria A is a population decline over 3 generations. And for bears, a generation is 10 years. So it's a decline over 30 years. And that can be the past, the present, which means 15 years on either side of today, or projected into the future. And criteria A is what most of the other species fall under, vulnerable under that, like the sun bear, the sloth bear, the Andean bear, and Asiatic black bear, I think, are all under criteria A. B is small, highly fragmented range. That doesn't really apply to bears. C is small population plus a decline, and this is the giant panda fell under that, the vulnerable. Very small populations, criteria D. That's where isolated brown bear populations often fall under. And then E is a quantitative analysis, like a PVA. So those are the criteria we go through when we're listing. But doing the red list also includes mapping the species, listing threats, listing conservation actions. It's a very, quite a detailed undertaking. And if you haven't done it, I really recommend you go to the IUCN RedList website and you go under the species you're interested in and just see what's there. Okay, brown bears. They are by far the world's most widely distributed species of bear. And there's probably 200,000 of them roughly, and they're fairly stable at the global scale. They are least concerned. They are not vulnerable. There is little chance that they'll be extinct. If the Gobi bear disappeared, wouldn't matter. They'd still be vulnerable. Hokkaido bear, Gobi bear, I don't know, Cantabrian Mountains bear, Yellowstone bear, they all disappear. Wouldn't matter. They'd still be, least concern. But of course, to millions of people, it would matter. It would be a disaster for those ecosystems and whatnot. So to not list them by the population, we thought was missing out on an important aspect of these widely distributed species like the brown bear, is that there are, we think, 44 isolated populations, and to lose them does matter. So we have listed them by individual population, which was a big undertaking. Now, this is a familiar map that most of you have seen many times. And what I want to really mention here is that this predator cleansing that went on when Europeans first settled North America, sure, they virtually eliminated bears from most of the lower 48 states, plus the prairies. But in British Columbia and Western Alberta, they remained there, but their numbers were no doubt greatly reduced. It's not like that the people that settled the US and prairies were really bad on carnivores, and the people in BC were different and loved carnivores. No, that's not what happened. They were hit back pretty hard there too. So these numbers were greatly depressed, at least in the southern part. Today, we're going to talk about this area right here, the southern part of Canada, where the brown bears are. I will just quickly cover the Rockies. Michael Proctor will do this interior mountain range outside of the Rockies, and Michelle will cover the coastal mountains. So first, to an isolated population, we had to define, and we defined it as less than one female immigrant per generation, which is 10 years for all the bear species we've used. And that is our own definition. That's one that the brown bear team for Europe and Asia, before we had a North American team, came up with, and that's what we decided made a population isolated. And the mapping was done by females, boundary of female bears, largely because male bears can show up almost anywhere. If we were to map any grizzly bear, well, then I guess the Selway Bitterroot would be mapped, because we know from Steve's book that they head down there once in a while. Vancouver Island would probably have to have a bunch mapped, because we know males show up there every year or two. So we've limited it to females. That's our definition. So this is the NCDE, Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem in the US. Oh, someone asked something? Okay, anyway, there's probably about 1,100 bears there. And if you include the bears that are fully connected north of the border, there's probably about 200 in BC and Alberta. There's a pile of bears here. Here's where I started working, right about where this 140 number is, about 40 some odd years ago. And this population was much rarer back then. There were fewer bears. The numbers tripled over the first 20 years I was working there, and bears started to spill out from the Flathead area into Alberta, like young females I had collared moving out of these few hot spots. No doubt the same was happening in the NCDE. Numbers were increasing and they were distributing further and further out. This is a famous fracture, at least for people interested in the grizzly bears and other species. I think this is the reason that this is Highway 3 goes through here. I think I'm pretty sure this is the reason why Y-to-Y was started. It's this fracture here, and that's what I'll briefly talk about. But you got to remember that there's a lot of bears in this area, and that's important. This fracture here is Highway 3 fracture, and it's a fascinating area because it's about 100 kilometers across, but there's 7 towns in it with about 20,000 people. There's the typical rural settlements, some small farms. There's 5 big major active open pit coal mines, railway and highways to service the mines and all the people there. There's a big ski resort. There's the amount of outdoor recreation there. People are doing everything. They're all over the place. So it's a very, very busy valley. We've always been concerned about it. So about 15 years ago, Clayton and I collared some bears there just to see what was going on with the fracture, because that's one of the big fractures in Mike Proctor's monograph was Highway 3. And we collared 8 males and 8 females that was within half a home range of the valley bottom. And 4 males and 3 of the females did cross the valley at least once. And one of the females that didn't cross the valley, she lived south of the valley, right up to the highway area. She had cubs, she lived down there, but she had been born north. So by our criterion, that is not a fracture, really. It doesn't make the NCD isolated population. It is part of the mother lode of North American grizzly bears. Clayton Lamb is recently doing a much more detailed and a lot better study of that area. He's doing an incredible job. And he has caught 71 bears, grizzly bears, in that fracture amongst all those people. And many interesting things. It's a fascinating area that once they become adults, their survival is pretty good. It's over 95%. Once they make it to be adults, they figured it out. They know how to do it. But the subadult survival is terrible. I mean, if you're a subadult male living in that valley, there's a low probability you'll live to this time next year. I mean, 45% survival, and females isn't a lot better. There's a lot of issues there, and it's because of that high mortality rate in the valley. It's certainly a sink. And fortunately, there's bears moving in from all over because it's very good habitat all through there. So it maintains that connectivity. Plus, there's been a lot of work done in there. I mean, the environmental groups and others have lobbied and got the Nature Conservancy to manage 54,000 acres of land that was kind of semi-donated, I think, from the industry, Shell Oil and Tembec, a big logging company. And we have Wild Safe BC people working there trying to reduce attractants. And Clayton's done just a great job too of getting attractants like roadkill ungulates, that there's piles in that valley, get them out of the way so bears can't access them. Clayton's doing a great job there. It's a very exciting study area. I mean, to catch 71 grizzlies in a valley like that is, to me, amazing. 71 black bears would be exciting. Anyway, mortality, there's lots. This is a whole family, a mother with 3 cubs. There's the 3 cubs hit by the train. About half the mortalities are trains and railways, and the other half are conflicts. But the mortality rate's high. There's just a lot of people in the valley. So anyway, that's the Rockies. It is still connected, and because of that, the NCDE, Flathead, and southwestern Alberta are part of the mother lode of grizzlies. Okay, that's my bit. Michael's turn.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm sharing my screen. Got the baton handoff here. Did it work?
It's in the process, I think. There you go. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. The thing I like about Bruce's talks is he gives you a lot of history. I'm, excuse me, I might be older than Bruce, but I don't have that history that he has. I always enjoy that. So I'm going to talk about the Selkirk. Excuse me. Sorry, I haven't spoken much this morning. The Selkirk population and the Yahk, and I'm going to talk about connectivity across these fractures here a little bit. And so I'm going to provide a tiny bit of Proctor history. And this is back when I had 2 eyes and I was a little cuter, no gray hair. And when I started working with Bruce way back doing the DNA, that's me up there, and it's Patco and Strobeck. You remember those guys? They were part of this revolution of getting hair off there. And Bruce was out there in a field working with me at some point. And I'm going to show you the first paper I really published on this, just to give you a sense of where these populations were 20 years ago. And then we're going to talk about where they are now. So this is the flathead. That's the fragmentation across the flathead where Bruce worked. Across the valley, there's of course no fragmentation. There's complete mixing across that population. And then the Highway 3, the Rockies that he just talked about, this is our paper from 2005. And you know, we did pick up a couple little female migrants and a couple male migrants, but you can see they're starting to spread apart and be fragmented. Not completely fragmented, but starting to be fragmented. And then in the Yahk, Highway 3 continues across the Purcell Mountains, and you can see it's about the same as the Rockies. We had no female migrants there, but we had, you can start to see the separation of animals. And then the South Selkirks, this was the most shocking thing we found. We went, oh my God, how can this happen? This is across Highway 3A right here north of there, looking into the central Selkirks. In future years, we've realized that we should measure it this way, and it's not quite as separate, but still it's basically the same pattern. I didn't even believe this result until I redid another survey in the Selkirks, and I have Dave Patco rerun the analysis to convince myself that this was really true. But this is what we were dealing with for a really isolated population in the South Selkirks. And this is what's isolating it, is a sort of an agricultural human settled valley. It's partially a wildlife management area and partially a settled area. And I decided to then, this is what it looks like. It's not very far, separated by 5 to 7 kilometers of a mix of wildlife management area, but also quite a bit of agriculture. But I think the COs used to tell me a bear had a lifespan about 3 days when he got down in that valley. And over the years, that was created that fragmentation. And, this was a bear. This bear here, all he did was dig a tiny little hole in this garden. And of course, this bear had a death sentence when he broke into this house. But so later years, after we accumulated a lot of data, we put radio collars on bears with Chris Savine and Wayne Caseworm. I became the Transborder Grizzly Bear Project and worked in conjunction with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the Canadian side. And even though a lot of the things we did were international, today I'm sort of going to report on Canada because this is a sort of a Canada content part of the PSG group here today. But recall that Chris and Wayne had a heck of a lot to do with everything I did. And at any rate, this is a mortality risk model built on reported and unreported mortality in the front country and back country mortality. And you can see there's sort of these walls of mortality. This is the Rockies where Bruce was just talking about, and this is the Purcells, this is the Yahk. And it's pretty hard for a bear to get through here, and they basically don't. They just get in there and they get killed. And the same occurs down here with the Selkirks, even between the Selkirks and the Purcells. And so I decided to create a job for myself as an unemployed hippie living in the Kootenays, having a really nice time, and started to try to help see if I could fix this in some way. So decided that we needed to manage wildlife, habitat, and people. And this is how I got my start. At any rate, so we did, Chris and Wayne and I did a giant study of put radio collars on for 15 years and tried to estimate habitat quality and identify some corridors. And then this map, the yellow are the sort of the identified corridors where bears are not necessarily moving, but maybe a few males are, but maybe it was the best option for managing for. And so one of my areas to try is right here, connecting the southern Selkirks, So like I said, the Purcell connection to the Selkirks is a little better. We decided there was a little more hope there. So part of the goal was to move bears, get bears moving into the Selkirks and then maybe get them moving down into the Cabinets or wherever they might go. But I decided to try a pilot project, and I fixed fragmentation. And this is a close up of the mapping of that corridor function. The flames are where the corridor is most prolific, or would be most should concentrate our management efforts. And see these little blue triangles and this blue lot. This is one of the things we did to manage connectivity was to get land trusts to go buy land right in the middle of our corridors, in the hopes of managing that land for wildlife friendly ways, but to reduce the human density to facilitate wildlife movement. And so these are the properties that were bought after we did a lot of this research with by the Nature Conservancy Canada. Kind of cool. And that program kind of blew up into the larger region. So here's the area I was talking about. We've been also buying land across to connect the Yahk across Highway 3 and the Purcells and down into the US. It's truly an international project we're doing. And you can see some of these other fractures. We've been purchasing land through these various organizations and land trades. And we've been pretty successful. We've got a lot of land. And there's a really cool story that I will not tell about how this got started with me and Chris Servine. But anyway, so the other things we did was we copied the Montana non-lethal management program. I started working with the BC Conservation Officer Service and capturing sort of what I call early conflict light bears before they really get into trouble too bad. And we go in and we manage them in various ways, keep them in a trap overnight and different things to, and then let them go usually close by, but not within their home range. And we had a pretty good success rate. You can see of the bears we chose to do, we had about a 74% success rate over the life of the collar, not necessarily over the life of the bear. We do have some bears that get killed, a couple years later. But the point is, it was pretty successful in saving females. Females seem a little smarter. They learn a little quicker than males. Of course, we already all know that. But at any rate, we also had a very important part of the project is the cost share electric fence program that we got going. We spent by now, this is up over $100,000. We've get the local people to secure their attractants in that agricultural valley. Also to do this, of course, you realize that we're encouraging bears to move through and maybe sometimes live and hang around in this human settled valley. So we put a lot of energy into human safety. We taught bear spay courses and taught people how to live with bears safely. We've had one attack and somewhat of a light public response and retaliation. So it's been a pretty effective program. People are somewhat tolerant. And part of our program too is to work in the backcountry. You can't have a bridge to nowhere. So we're in the southern Selkirks. This is a complex slide. I'm not going to leave it on here too long, but the green in here, we did some huckleberry patch modeling. So we've identified all the huckleberry patches in the area, and the green is a really good huckleberry patches, and the red are the closed roads in this Nature Conservancy private land piece back here in the backcountry. The province of BC hasn't really endorsed backcountry road closures in this area too much yet. They do it in some places, but we've had sort of a natural experiment where we were closing roads around this really prolific huckleberry patch. And we've got a paper coming out on this right now, but it turned out to be pretty cool. We have much higher densities of females and higher reproductive rates, higher fitness for the females in that area. Just sort of demonstrating what we've all known in other jurisdictions, that closing roads around important food habitats can really be beneficial for bears. But that's part of the program to work the backcountry and work the front country when we're trying to solve this problem. And this is just a summary slide of the cumulative movement. So pre-2005, this is what Chris and Wayne and I threw together every scrap of data we had. And it was actually quite a bit of data by that time. But we had very few movements of animals between these populations. And then after 15 years of working on it, applying all these programs, we kept tabs on this. I did the analysis wondering, wow, we've the pink, of course, sorry for the sex bias coloring there, but the pink are the females. And so we're starting to see the females move. We're seeing more animals move. We're starting to see that happen. And importantly, we've actually now we've documented males and females moving into the Selkirks that are actually breeding after they move. So it's sort of functional connectivity. Movement is one thing, but movement and sex is a whole lot better. You guys probably already knew that, but just so I'd remind you. But at any rate, so now we've also done in Canada anyway, we've done a big 2-year DNA survey over the last 2 years, and the data is just hanging on a thread above my computer. We don't have the final result. We had about 80 bears in the international population in 2005. And I'm getting hints at what the data is, but I can't say it yet because, you don't say a number until you've got the final number, but it's actually pretty impressive. Wayne Caseworm has been doing some really excellent monitoring down here with cameras and DNA, and he's got some bears, and we're going to combine and make an international estimate, and it's going to be pretty significant. It will be over 100. We know that for sure. It'll be somewhere between 100 and 130. The point is we've had a pretty significant increase in the number of bears there. Down in the valley, the Nature Conservancy is, because it's been so successful, they've made the valley sort of a corridor, and they've got a place trying to get the community to understand what's going on and accept it, which is kind of true. It's kind of a cool multi-species thing. A lot going on more beyond bears. It's pretty neat. Real briefly, I'm going to talk about the Yahk. Very briefly, we've not had such good success connecting the Yahk up in Canada, although we haven't done a real good monitoring. We do know we have more bears there. This is the Yahk population and the roads in Canada. This is the amount of secure habitat. That is habitat farther than 500 meters from a road. There's not a lot of places. And this is the amount we've lost in the last 15 years since I've been working there. So the roads are just continually being built. So we're approaching British Columbia with this data, and they're actually open, and we've opened some discussions about having some access management in there. I think that's what's necessary to, even though we got bears moving in there, we need to keep them alive. And then, so my last slide is about the Granby Kettle, which is, if you can see in the map, it's just a little farther to the west. We're working ourselves to Michelle. And this kind of a complex slide. Clayton Lamb did a really nice DNA survey over there in 2016 and published it in 2017. And they found an increase of bears from like 38 to 87. It was a pretty significant increase. And part of the reason that they attributed, we're all authors on that, me and Bruce, is that they created a park in 1995, 2 big parks they created where they put off applied access management, and they had these access management areas off to the right and the left, the east and the west of the park, which really seemed to have a pretty big effect. And Clayton did a good job of showing the link between the spatial link between the new population estimate and the improvement in bears. So it's another notch in the belt that access management matters. And I caught a bear over here just not far from where Michelle lives, who actually migrated over and into the Granby and found one of our huckleberry patches. They're kind of cool. So, the connectivity in this area is across Highway 3. It should be pretty good. There's almost no humans. The humans are the white along here. These are the buildings. So it's a pretty free, open area. It's a busy highway, but not that busy. I actually saw this grizzly bear right on the highway right there. So there should be some connectivity down across this population into the states over time. And to the north, it's pretty much connected over Highway 6. So that gives you a sense of the Granby Kettle. It has potential to, there are a few bears that dribble down into the states here. Someday you may have another recovery zone. And I think that's it for me. And now I'll unhook and pass this over to Michelle.
There we go. I had to unmute myself so I could get the screen up. I'll do this in record time because we're running out a bit. And so this is moving westward from where Michael was just talking about across the Okanagan Valley, which is heavily populated by people, and into the southern Coast Mountain Ranges and the Cascade Mountains. There we go. So this is kind of the end kind of where the population or grizzly bear distribution ends along this part of North American distribution. And BC has identified, these population units, which some of which are actual populations that are separate from each other, and others are contiguous within and have some movement between. Starting in about 2005, Clayton Apps and Bruce and Steve Rochetta did huge DNA grids covering most of the southern part of the Coast Mountain Range, excluding the Cascade Mountains and Hat Creek population that you see here though. And they found that there were well over, then probably populations have been growing, but in the green there where the populations are contiguous, there were hundreds of bears, and they also found much lower distributions or lower numbers and isolated populations in the Garibaldi Pit, which is kind of, if you know where Whistler is, it is that Highway 99 separates it from the northern mountains there. And then in the Stein Nahatlatch population unit, which is separated from to the north by big lakes. But these populations had no bears in the Garibaldi Pit were detected in 2006 or 5. And then the Stein Nahatlatch had about, they were expecting about 60 bears and ended up getting much fewer, around 20. And Hat Creek is probably extirpated now. In 2007, there was a female with cubs, but monitoring since with cameras on and off, and people use that area quite a lot, and no one has seen one since with a bear there since. And then the Cascade Mountains, there's one male documented there last year, and this is likely the same male that had genetic ancestries from the Monashees, so came over across from where Michael was just talking about. There haven't been any females documented in the Cascade Mountains in several decades. So using IUCN, that's definitely an isolated and probably extirpated population. We did a DNA marker recapture and telemetry based project in the South Chilcotin here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in the South Chilcotin area here and in the Stein Nahatlatch, by we I mean Bruce and I. And then Clayton Apps and Steve and Bruce did it again in the Toba Butte, and it's using about 10 years after their initial one in 2008. And we found in these green connected population areas that population growth was about 5% in the South Chilcotin from 2006 to 2016, and just a little bit more in the Toba Butte, which has the fish-eating bears at the beginning of the presentation, the big brown male in the snow. And but we found that in the Stein Nahatlatch, which is isolated, was declining kind of precipitously between 2005 2019 from both DNA marker recapture, OpenSeeker, and from using demographic vital rates to estimate population. The Garibaldi Pit, we don't really have an estimate of what's happening there, but there has been a female fishing in the Pit River, and that was not detected in Clayton's DNA grid in 2000, I think it was 2005, but could have been 2006. And then the Squamish Lillooet hasn't had like a repeated analysis of using either collaring vital rate data or DNA marker capture, but the number of, where you see bears and the population seems to be doing similar things as in the South Chilcotin and Toba Butte. So we predict that it is likely population is likely growing and probably at the same rate as the other two up there. This is where the people are in this area. So these are the things that we're estimating to see what is linking or what is hindering population connectivity here. The usual suspect of human settlement. So all these black dots are buildings, and we see a lot along the Fraser, but these are mostly spread out. Oh, sorry. And then little pockets in cities. It's hard to get the kind of density there, but these are showing where a lot of where the fragmentation occurs along this red is the Highway 99. This is not an actual population fragment, but if females don't cross this highway or haven't since we've been monitoring them. And this is also a limit a bit to males as well. over the course of our research, we've found some interpopulation movement, but one older female who was collared for a very long time, she did one trip around this whole population unit and then went home for again and never came back. So that was an interesting movement, but we've never seen that repeated again. And then between the Stein and Nahatlatch and the South Chilcotins, 4 males have immigrated that we've documented northward, one of which were reproduced there has several F1 offsprings that are mixed heritage. And then only 1 male moved, 2 males actually probably by now, but 1 male moved south and was killed in the Stein and Nahatlatch. And there's 1 cub now documented that has genetic ancestry from the South Chilcotin. And the 1 male I spoke about previously had come over from the Monashees that was seen in the North Cascades. So the barriers to connectivity in this area include both anthropogenic and natural barriers. The Thompson River over here is a very large river that also has the Highway 1 and railways along it. And then the Stein Nahatlatch is separated again by the Fraser River, which is a very large, voluminous river with steep banks, canyons, rapids, and dry kind of marginal habitat flanking either side. The Squamish, Lillooet, Garibaldi Pit and most of the area is heavily influenced by the proximity of Vancouver. So 3 million people live within 45-minute drive of here, and it is the vacation spot. So there's been about a 300% increase in human recreational use in the backcountry and in mountain biking and hiking in 2020 from previous years, and expected to continue 2021. And this is it's amazing how much this has actually changed. Where we used to monitor cars in the parking lot in Joffrey Lakes, which is a popular hike in the middle of the populations here. And we used to see maybe 30 vehicles on a Saturday. Now you'll see about 350 on a Wednesday. You can't even count them. So the increase in recreational use has been astronomical and very difficult to quantify and measure any impacts as a result so far. But also keeping in mind that these mountain ranges are extremely rugged. So they're steep, rocky, ice fields, glaciers. And so there's patches of good habitat mixed in with these natural limitations and surrounded by people to the south. So in the Stein Nahatlatch, so the one that has about 15 individuals left and is declining, remains isolated as far as female go. And it's likely that it's been isolated for a very long time. This area has been used by people extensively for thousands of years. Productive salmon rivers there had meant that there have been people living and fishing along the Fraser River and tributaries. It's forever, basically, as far as this is concerned. And then in 1958, the proliferation of guns following the Fraser River gold rush brought in settler communities and those sorts of impacts and likely high incidence of historic mortality. The north of Stein Nahatlatch is also divided by these very large lakes that I suspect would limit females crossing. Unlike other populations that are threatened populations of grizzly bears, the road density is relatively low. It's about 0.16 kilometers per kilometer squared. And this is partially because of the rugged terrain and it's difficult to build lots of roads, and partially because it is a wet ecosystem and roads don't last long. They regenerate naturally very quickly. Within a 5 to 10 years, it becomes really difficult to walk through. And so I don't think we have the same road density issues here as some of the other populations. Other things that are affecting the Stein Nahatlatch population or indices of that is that this population has likely been isolated for a very long time. The fixation index shows that it has very different genetic structure than all the neighboring populations that you see that are mostly in the green in the previous maps. We've measured very late age of primiparity, females not reproducing until 11 or 12 years old. Relatively low adult female survival at 82%. And then also low cub survival rates, 33%, despite having large litter sizes. I mean, the population, the sample sizes are small, so these will obviously be a little bit more on the extremes, but still they were significantly different than all the others. And we also have longer than average interbirth intervals estimated in the Stein and Nahatlatch. So these issues are contributing to the continued decline of that population. And then, although there's some efforts to improve connectivity to northern populations, it's sort of beginning. I think that's all I've got. If anybody has to add anything or have any questions.
One summary statement I might add that Bruce and I were discussing, maybe Bruce, was, you know, when you think about all our areas, the Rocky Mountains where Bruce was talking about is the most populated, most inundated by humans, but it's got the most connectivity. So, and the reason is it's got the most bears. So some of this fragmentation stuff is related to the density of bears in the adjacent populations. I think Bruce can maybe speak to that a little bit more, but so, you know, it's one thing that's the humans that are in causing this, but also the number of bears is a sort of a dance with the number of humans. So.
Yeah, I really, that's been my observations for sure, having, you know, lived and worked in all of these populations. I'm just waiting for the northern in the coast mountains where Michelle's talking about the northern populations to get up to the densities that we see in the Rockies, like the Flathead and Elk Valley, and start spilling through. I live in the fracture. I have a 15-hectare yard, and I am in the fracture, and I can hardly wait for them to start spilling through my yard. I have the best bear habitat in the fracture, but and I think it's going to happen, and then fill into the Stein Nahatlatch. Stein Nahatlatch is a sick population right now. For, as Michelle says, been isolated a long time. It's not doing well, and the habitat may not be, not as good as the Flathead or somewhere, but it's not that bad, I don't think. So I expect once these populations to the north start getting into good densities, that we'll start seeing them spilling through. I agree. It's you get good numbers, you'll get some bears moving.
And that just highlights to me one of the reasons we started also working in the backcountry to improve connectivity with our access management around those huckleberry patches. So improving the quality of the habitat and the security in the adjacent populations can have an impact on that connectivity. I think that's the link from a bear manager standpoint.
Yeah.
There has been some work in the Pemberton Valley in similar, the bear hazard assessments, and the Nature Conservancy did buy a large property for connectivity based on the research that we've done there. But I think up and coming is the huge change in human use in the last 5 years is unbelievable. Like it's hundreds of, like 300% here in Nelson, and there the 3 million people times 300% goes up quickly adjacent to there.
It's busy in the South Coast Mountains. Steve Rochetta, the biologist out of Squamish, he says that every weekend it's 5,000 drunks with guns camping up the Squamish River. He says it's not a healthy place to be a bear. So there's 3 million people living right there. It's got challenges. But then look at the Elk Valley. There's 20,000 people living in that valley, and Clayton caught 71 grizzlies in amongst them. So there's hope. There's hope.
I think so.
Michelle, what do you attribute that late age at first reproduction in that Stein population? Is that genetics or what?
That's my guess. I mean, looking at how isolated it is, there's low heterozygosity. There's many, like almost all instances of reproduction that we've noticed using pedigrees have been, sibling, sib, parent offspring reproductions, and in other species, we know that definitely leads to all sorts of issues, including late age primiparity and lower lifetime reproductive output and increased lifetime mortality. I think that's a part of the issue. I think is likely that, the population is so small that in each year there are very few females available to reproduce. So I think we might end up seeing a little bit higher infanticide potentially with cubs. Like mortality is high for cubs and adults alike in that population. And I mean, it varies. High natural mortality there too, higher than proportionally than anywhere.
How many animals in that isolated population?
About 20.
Oh, so have you guys given any thought to augmentation like we had to revert to in the cabinet?
Yeah, it's been in the plans for probably 5 years now. We did move one bear there in 2016 or 17, I think. And she, from the neighboring population, but she just returned back home after spending a year there. She was actually really, it was interesting because as you know, you had her collared, and as she was moving along the fracture, she was really hesitant to cross where the people were living. It took a full year walking up and down it before she actually went home. But there are plans for that to, Indigenous-led plans for that to happen this summer. So we'll see if it actually pans out. But yeah, I think those are the objectives so far.
Other questions?
I have a question that's not necessarily about grizzly bears, but about the methods. How it's always wondered how small of a population you could get a good estimate for. And one of the graphs you had, it was less than 10.
Yeah, it's really, it was, to me, it was interesting that we could get one that was different at all because of that, the population size. So I mean, given that you would, it is quite possible that you'd resample a population again, and you would get very drastically different results because the population is so small. But if you look at even just the raw numbers of the detected individuals over the 15 years that we monitored them genetically, you just see it declining each year with 0 new individuals in some years, you know, and each new individual was the known offspring of 2 others. So it was almost like we were censusing rather than sampling at a certain point because we knew all the bears because there aren't.
Yeah, the population is pretty small, yeah. So
it ends up being more of a census than an estimate at a certain point.
And
yeah, you know, but if you knew, I guess what I wonder is if you knew the number was likely to be small, did you do anything to try to get the estimate to be better, more corral, you know, hair corral collection sites, or I don't know, make it more closer than the population, or just run it like you do all the others and see what happens?
Well, we continue. I mean, our sampling intensity wasn't super broad like it was in the first year. We actually ended up stopping collaring bears there because we were worried about the potential for adverse effects of collaring in such a small population. So when we started, we didn't realize, like we were just trying to figure out what was happening within that population. And then there were so many natural mortalities that we kind of got freaked out and decided to stop collaring them there for fear of potentially further hurting the population, although we never had any issues. It's just one of those precautionary things.
Right.
And, you know, it's always been a tug of war between confidence intervals and when you get those low sample sizes. But what I did they weren't as small as that population, but so I did a higher intensity of sampling. We're trying to, like, we just did it in the Selkirks, and because I want to try to catch all those females looking for migrants and looking for reproduction and all that. But there's another little tricky way to see if you got everybody. And we get if you get a pedigree of, if you catch everybody, you should probably be able to put together a bit of a pedigree. And if you've got a lot of animals that don't fit in that pedigree, it might mean there's more bears out there. What happens in the cabinets, for instance, in the States, is almost every new bear that they get out of a very small population fits into that pedigree. We have the mother and the father. So we're more confident that we have everybody. That's sort of another little side door for knowing, do you have everyone?
Yeah, we did the same here. We did the same here.
I think there's two populations that there might be some confusion. The one that's less than 10, we haven't done much work in. we did a big broad grid across, 60,000 square kilometers in 2004 to 2008 or something. And that's all we did in that, less than 10. It is a big park, Garibaldi Provincial Park mostly. We haven't done much. We didn't get one bear. I did see a track in it. So that we don't have much good information for there. We're relying mostly on observations of park people, and nobody sees almost any bears. So the less than 10 is a guess. The Stein Nahatlatch, the one that Michelle's mostly talking about, is one that we have done DNA every year for 10 years or so. We've pretty well got every bear. We don't get many strange bears there.
Right.
No, and they're all, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Dad.
We have a pretty good estimate there because we've got everybody, I think. But the other one, we really don't know what's going on. It's a very the Squamish, the Garibaldi pit, the one with less than 10. There isn't any access really. So it's very expensive to do that often. It would be tough. So we haven't really looked at it much. There's just very few bears, less than 10. We don't really know.
Yeah.
I haven't done pedigree yet. It seems like it takes a lot of markers whenever I asked Dave Putko how many markers I would need, but
we extended out to 21, and at even the mother-daughter were similar enough that 2 bears that we had handled and captured were identified as the same individual at 8 loci, and when we extended it out to 21, we could see that they were different. That's why we started doing that there, was because at first these were like, well, they're not the same bear because we touched them. That's not in a DNA census, and so they were so similar that we ended up having to extend it just for identification.
Right.
Michelle, we got a question here. What are your thoughts on the demographic or the possibility of demographic rescue by the Toba GPU?
I think for the Stein Nahatlatch, I mean, both the Selkirks and the Squamish Lillooet are also growing, and they're directly adjacent to those populations. So I think that's the most likely route, but they're all connected in there. So growth is occurring in the Toba Butte as well as the Selkirks populations, and they're kind of, I mean, there are, when you look at the home ranges of bears within them, the females are kind of different between the 2 areas, but the populations are totally connected. So yeah, I think that's the most likely route to recovery for those isolated populations now is demographic rescue from the northern contiguous ones.
Okay. We got another question here from Kate relating to recreational use in the US. We're seeing in this amazing expanse of recreational use, and particularly mountain biking. And the question is, when will we be able to, or when we should we say that we need to push back on the levels of recreational use that are affecting these bears? And I know this is something near and dear to your heart, Michelle. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm working on measuring it. I just don't have the number of grizzly bears specifically here, but we've seen in Nelson, like I said before, 300% increase in 2020 from 2019 in mountain bike use locally. And I think it's higher even in the coast mountains. So I definitely think there's, just because the magnitude of it, I definitely think it's worth looking at. Like anecdotally, I've seen that the bears continue to use the trails that people are building, not quite at the same rate as other linear features on the landscape, but I haven't done the analysis to actually tell you exactly what I found in that regard. But I know that some work has shown that I don't know whether mountain biking is more intense for the bears than hiking is. It's just the number of people maybe, but perhaps more dangerous for the bikers just by virtue of how fast they move.
Yeah. And the idea that mountain biking is a non-consumptive use, or that hiking is a non-consumptive use, I think we have to evolve out of that. And we're certainly getting to the levels of use that are consumptive on the bears in terms of their behavior and where they are on the habitat. So
definitely. And like the cycling club here in Nelson were the ones that approached me to identify how they should be building trails to lessen their impacts on wildlife. So there is some grassroots sort of interest in this. And I've in many neighboring sites, I mean, there's of course there's a variation among everyone that says that, but you know, people, the trail builders themselves were concerned that they were building trails in areas that had impacts, but they just didn't know anything about wildlife, so they couldn't really apply it themselves. So there is some movement towards that, and hopefully you can harness that interest still here, so it actually has an impact, but we'll see.
You know, one other comment on that regard, we're just publishing a paper right now about the relationship to some of these better huckleberry patches and reproduction and bear density. And it turns out that, you know, we've got a subset of huckleberry patches in really secure habitat where there's no roads and no nothing. And we're seeing the link between the huckleberries and the bear density and the reproduction. But then the subset of huckleberry patches that are in non-secure habitat within 500 meters of road are almost having no contribution to that fitness and reproductive success and density. One of the, you know, limits to the study, we can't perfectly separate direct mortality from those roads and displacement, but in some ancillary analyses, there is some reasonable evidence that this displacement is being part of that equation. And so that argues that we might push back a little bit if, because especially in the areas with really good food, because we want to, you know, especially these populations are trying to grow back, like in the Stein, we want to let those bears have access to that undisturbed food source so they can reproduce, et cetera. But it's imperfect data, but it's certainly shining in that direction.
The basic advice I've been giving to the cycling club is make your trails high density where they are and don't try to branch them all over the place. You know, because the one advantage of that sport over others is that they don't care if the trail is 20 feet from the other one. It's the trail that they're there for, not the view. So in the most cases, so it like capitalizing on that, what the people want to make it better for bears, I think is somewhat possible. I mean, not everywhere, but you know, don't build a brand new trail over to this mountain. Just keep it right next to the other trail if you can. It's sort of the advice I've been giving them so far.
That's the Nelson mountain bikers, but
Yeah.
the Whistler mountain bikers, they're a little older, a little richer, some of them. They like those. I mean, they've got excavators up in the mountains making bike trails, little mini excavators. They're a beautiful alpine. God, it's I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that going on around Whistler.
Yeah, they make excavator trails here too, but yeah, it's true.
Well, everybody, this has been a useful and fascinating discussion. Really, we're at the top of the hour. We want to respect everybody's time. We appreciate the fact that you guys presented this stuff. It's really fascinating. You know, this is the bleeding edge of brown bear conservation, where these small populations are trying to expand and interacting with people and how we can serve them. And that's the future. And we thank you all for your presentations. This will be posted to our YouTube site shortly. And we look forward to all of you joining us on May, 11th here, where we're going to have our next panel discussion on habituation in bears and how we deal with these habituated bears on top of people. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.